In the music production space, many people have this nostalgia for all of the legendary analog gear from back in the day. They want to get their hands on it themselves and have it in their own studio, and then they go on eBay or Reverb and look at the prices of these things, and they're like, what? That's crazy. It's unobtainably expensive. And they say stuff like, I wish I could go back to the 1980s and get hold of some of this stuff while it was still an affordable price and you could still get it. Now it's just too expensive, unobtainable, and I've missed the boat. Well, I'm going to call bullshit on that sentiment, and in this video we're going to go through the facts and look at how brutally expensive some of this stuff was back in the 1970s and 80s. But what we're even talking about here, let's give a couple of examples to get the conversation started so we know the general terrain of how the prices have changed over the years in the second-hand market today. So if you look at a Mini Moog, you could walk into a store and pick one up back in the day for 1,500 quid. That was the original retail price. So if you think about it, 1,500 quid, it's not like you can just go and buy one every day, but like if that's your passion, 1,500 quid isn't that much money. I've spent more than that on Eurorack gear, significantly more. And so 1,500 quid, okay, fine, give me a Mini Moog. And then you look at it on the second-hand market today, and it's like, what, 15 grand or something? Like, what? I can't afford 15 grand to buy a monophonic synth. It's not even recallable. There's no presets on it. It's not digital. There's nothing. It's just crackly analog pots, and I can make one sound at a time. It sounds a bit expensive to me, so the prices have gone up a lot, right? And if you think about a Roland TR-808 drum machine, very legendary unit, and that when it came out, how much could I get one of those? I would just walk to my local music store and pick one up. How much is that going to cost me? 1,200 quid was the original retail price. You think, bargain price. How much can I get one today? With thousands and thousands, it depends what condition. It's a very wide range, but thousands of dollars or euros or pounds a TR-808 is going to cost you in working condition today. So you think, there you go. Of course it's better to get in a time machine because the prices have gone up outrageously. You've now got like no warranty. They might go wrong. There's hardly anyone to repair them. They're like getting old. Like, what? Of course they've gone up. How can you argue otherwise? So the more astute viewers here have already figured out that the missing link here is inflation, because back in the 1970s and 80s, 1,500 quid got you a lot more stuff than it does today. Now you could go over to an inflation calculator website, put in the price and the year, and it will give you a price in today's money. But the problem with that is it's not very accurate doing it that way. Why? Well, I discuss this in a bit more detail on my second channel, Smoke and Speculation, where I talk about money and financial stuff. And the video specifically is called The Socialism Scam, and I go through it in that video, but I want to keep it fairly apolitical on this channel, so I'm not going to go into the full reasons why it's underrepresented and inaccurate with the government statistics, apart from the fact that the government are a bunch of lying thieves who just want to steal your money, and the way that they do that is not only through taxation, but through stealth taxes, and inflation is also a stealth tax. So they steal your money and transfer money from the poor to the rich through inflation, so they want as much inflation as possible, but they want to lie about it and say that the number is as low as possible. So the true amount of inflation is vastly underrepresented by the government figures, and there's very obvious examples of this historically. But you can just take some other benchmark to measure the price of what that would have been by just converting that to that commodity back in the 1970s and 80s, and then converting that commodity back into money nowadays and see what that number is. And it's often way higher than it is if you put that number into a price calculator. Now, the gold standard is gold. Now, of course, this isn't a 100% accurate method because the price of gold does fluctuate due to global events and speculation and trading, but you can go back even to ancient Rome and look how much a house cost back then priced in gold, and look at how much a house costs today priced in gold. And the differences aren't as wild as you might think. A lot of things have stayed very constant throughout all of human civilization, pretty much. And you can even price things in other assets like loaves of bread. That's another popular one, which economists sometimes do. So using loaves of bread or gold or baskets of commodities is actually a far more accurate method at looking at inflation than just trusting the government statistics, which are pretty much just invented because of their substitutions and hedonics and all the stupid games that they play to calculate the CPI. So when you see a vintage Minimoog on Reverb for 15 grand, it's not actually a rip-off. It's actually a massive discount. So the amount of money that the original musician had to sacrifice to own one back in the 1970s was way more than what you're actually paying in today's money when you buy one for that crazy price secondhand off Reverb today. So even if you could get into a time machine for free and go back to the 1970s and bring back a Minimoog, you're actually getting the deal of a century if you don't do that and buy one secondhand off Reverb for 15 grand. The prices back then were brutal and people don't seem to understand that. If you were alive in 1971 and you had a pile of gold, you'd have to sell about 56 ounces of that gold to buy an ARP 2600. Now, if you just not bought that synthesizer and kept the gold, you could sell the same amount of gold, 56 ounces today, for about $250,000. Now, although that is factually correct, back then the dollar was still on the gold standard, so America was kind of keeping the price of gold slightly artificially low. And so shortly after the ARP 2600 came out, they kind of defaulted essentially and took the dollar off the gold standard. And so then the price of gold went up a lot to about $200 and it came down again. So it's not exactly $250,000 in today's purchasing power, but it's a lot of money relatively. What it cost back then was an arm and a leg back then, and so you can buy it now for just a fraction of what it would have cost you relatively back then. So let's move out of the 1970s, where America's default off of the gold standard might distort the pricing slightly, and move to 1980. So that's the year where the Fairlight CMI came out, and it was priced retail at 26 grand. Now that's a lot of money. Even for today's money, 26 grand is a lot of money. But if we look at that converted to gold, and then we look at how many ounces that is in today's money, spot price is about 200 grand. So again, it's like Ferrari type money, and it's an 8-bit sampler. It's more or less the same audio quality as a Game Boy, and it costs 200 grand. And if you can get one of those for anything less, I don't know, like 15, 20 grand today, well, you've got a bargain, right? I don't know why anyone would want one today, other than some kind of collector's nostalgic value, but the price now, today, is massively lower than it would have been if you bought one new from the shop back in 1980. I don't think you can buy it from the shop. I think it was a specialist item. But anyway, you know what I mean. Next up, the Prophet 5 came out in 1978 and it cost around 4 grand. And if you think about it, it's not so different from what it costs nowadays. But if we convert that price into gold ounces in 1978 and see how much those same gold ounces cost now, well, they cost about 90 grand now. So if you buy a second-hand Prophet 5 for anything less than 90 grand, we're getting a massive discount off of how much it costs when it originally came out. Imagine going down to your local music shop, you're playing this Prophet 5, you think, oh, this is a cool thing, I want to buy this. How much does this cost? And it's like 92 grand. You'd be like, what? You're having a laugh. But that's how much it was if we priced it in gold back then. Now, there are some exceptions where the original gear was cheaper when it came out than it is on the second-hand market today, and one example is the 303. That came out in 1981, and at the time, Roland thought it was going to replace bass guitarists. They thought it was the next best thing, and they thought it was going to sell like hotcakes, but it flopped, and essentially no one wanted it, and so they priced it at $395 when it came out. That was less than 1 ounce of gold. And if you fast forward to the current year and look at the second-hand prices, it depends on the condition, of course, but let's just say 5 grand for a used 303 in decent condition. Well, if you look at the amount of gold that it would have cost back in the day, let's say less than 0.9 ounces of gold to buy that back in the day, it depends on what day you bought it on, because the price of gold obviously fluctuated within the year that it came out. But let's just say it's about 0.9, something like that. It's about 4 grand in today's money. So maybe it's slightly more expensive than when it came out, and that's literally Roland's worst product that flopped the hardest when it came out. Obviously, it's not the worst product nowadays or even in the 90s, but when it came out in the 80s, it was essentially Roland's worst product, and they priced it low because it wasn't selling. So even taking that into account, it's only appreciated in value very slightly, if at all. When you look at the price of gold recently, it's so volatile. By next week or next month, it could be at 5 or 6 grand grand even. So then it would actually be cheaper secondhand than if you'd bought it new from the shop back in the 80s at that low price, because they weren't selling them. So they couldn't give them away. So they put the price really low. Even despite that, they're going to be cheaper probably in a couple of months with the price of gold the way that it's going. So if you actually look at these prices relative to gold, not that much is cheaper back in the day. It was very expensive to buy the shit back in the day. And you can just keep on doing this and going down the list of all of the legendary analog gear from back in the day and see how it was actually more expensive to buy back then than it is secondhand now by, in most cases, a huge margin. And so the stuff back then wasn't cheap, it was actually really expensive. Of course, there's a bit more nuance to it, because not everyone went to the music store in the 1970s, bought something and held onto it all this time and they're selling it on Reverb today. Most people who made a profit on this stuff snapped it up at bargain prices in the early 90s or something, when it was seen to be obsolete or old school and it wasn't as in demand. And there was kind of like a low point in the early 90s and that kind of like time that before it became like legendary and there was a resurgence in all of this analog stuff, at some point it was quite cheap. So people were able to snap it up and make a big profit by holding on to it for either 10 or 20 or even more years. And you think, oh, they made a massive profit. They made a killing on holding this gear and then just selling it for inflated prices later. Well, yes and no. Although many people did make a profit, because some people snapped it up for next to nothing and they can sell it for real money, well, you've got to take into account inflation. Like when I moved to Germany almost 20 years ago now, I was renting this big warehouse space that I built my first studio in. It was 75 square meters, and I think it cost 160 euros a month back then. And 20 years later, it's now like over $1,000. It's definitely more than $1,000, because I know the previous person was paying north of 1,000. I don't know how much it's got now, because I haven't been in contact with whoever's there now, and they probably put the rent up since. But I wouldn't be surprised if it was 1,500. So that's like 10x in those 20 years. And so if you compare that and you look at the price of gold and all of these indicators, really, some of these people have held this gear for 20 years. They haven't made as much profit on it as some people think. And of course, nowadays, you can just get stock plugins or VCV Rack for free and do exactly the same things and more than you could do with stuff back in the day that cost literally like $250,000 in today's value measured in gold.